The countermove. It didn't take long for the pushback to begin. By midday, a team of high-profile lawyers representing CDC held a press conference, vehemently denying the allegations. They labeled Terrence as a desperate man trying to distract from his own misconduct. Meanwhile, Deputy Chief Richard Carlson released a statement claiming the investigation was politically motivated and based on fabricated evidence. He called for Terrence's immediate resignation and insisted he was being framed by overzealous reformists. "This is going to get ugly," Marcus muttered as they watched the statements on TV. "They're throwing everything they've got at you." Terrence stood, pacing the room. "Let them," he said. "The truth is on our side. The AG's office is verifying the evidence as we speak. Once it's confirmed, their denials won't hold water." "Assuming we survive that long," Claire added, glancing nervously at the window. The breaking point. That evening, Sarah Chen from the Attorney General's office arrived at the safe house. Her face was pale, and her usually confident demeanor seemed shaken. "They've escalated," she said, handing Terrence a folder. "We've uncovered credible evidence that Carlson and CDC have been using private security firms to target potential whistleblowers. Threats, bribes, even outright violence." Terrence's hands tightened around the folder. "How is this not already public knowledge?" "Fear," Sarah replied. "People are terrified to come forward. And now that this investigation has gone public, Carlson's people are moving to cover their tracks. We've already lost one key witness. A former CDC accountant was found dead this morning. They're calling it a suicide, but we know better." Claire's face went pale. "They're cleaning house." Sarah nodded. "And they're not stopping there. We've intercepted communications indicating that you, Marcus, and Claire are their next targets." Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "They're doubling down because they're desperate. That means we're close." Terrence's mind raced. "What's our next move? We can't just sit here and wait for them to come for us." Sarah hesitated. "The AG's office is preparing to issue arrest warrants for Carlson and several CDC executives, but it's a race against time. We need to secure more testimony, something irrefutable that ties Carlson directly to the crimes. Without it, there's a chance he could wiggle out of this." The final witness. One name stood out in the evidence. Ethan Rowe, a former project manager at CDC who had disappeared months earlier after blowing the whistle on unsafe working conditions at a construction site. According to Sarah, he was alive but in hiding, terrified for his life. Terrence knew that Rowe's testimony could be the final nail in Carlson's coffin, but convincing him to come forward would be no small feat. "I'll go," Terrence said. "If he's hiding, he won't trust law enforcement, but he might trust me." Marcus frowned. "That's a bad idea. You're already a target. If they find out where you're going, it's game over." Terrence shook his head. "We don't have a choice. If we don't get Rowe on record, Carlson could walk." A dangerous meeting. Ethan Rowe was hiding in a rundown motel on the outskirts of Crestfield, a place where anonymity was valued above all else. Terrence, Marcus, and Claire arrived just before midnight, their presence cloaked by the shadows of the deserted lot. "Room 212, Marcus said, checking the information Sarah had provided. They approached cautiously, knocking on the door in a specific rhythm to signal their identity. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, revealing a gaunt man with hollow eyes. "Judge Lewis," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Terrence nodded. "Ethan, we're here to help, but we need your testimony." Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway. "You don't understand. They'll kill me. They've already tried." Terrence stepped closer, his voice firm, but empathetic. "I do understand. They've come after me too. But if we don't stand together, they'll keep doing this. To you, to me, to everyone. We have a chance to stop them, but I need your help." For a moment, Ethan seemed ready to bolt, but then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it. But we have to be careful. They're watching. The final confrontation. As they left the motel with Ethan, Terrence's worst fears were realized. A black SUV screeched into the parking lot, blocking their exit. Armed men stepped out, their faces obscured by balaclavas. "Get down," Marcus shouted, drawing his weapon. "You think they're behind what's happening?" Marcus asked. "It's a theory," Terrence admitted. "But it's more than just a grudge. If they're involved, it's part of something much bigger." Marcus sipped his coffee thoughtfully. CDC doesn't get its hands dirty directly. They use intermediaries, shell companies, contractors, even lobbyists. If they're targeting you, it's because they see you as a threat to their operations. "And if that's the case," Terrence said, "we need proof. A suspicious connection." With Marcus's help, Terrence began tracing CDC's web of influence. They started with financial records, procurement contracts, and campaign donations. It didn't take long to notice a troubling pattern. Several city officials, including members of the police department, had received generous consulting fees from subsidiaries tied to CDC. One name stood out: Deputy Chief Richard Carlson. He had been the commanding officer behind the precinct where Officer Claire Craig worked. His record seemed spotless on the surface, but the financial records suggested otherwise. Over the past 3 years, Carlson had received multiple payments from a shell company called Evergreen Solutions, a name that had also appeared in CDC's financial disclosures. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. This guy Carlson is dirty. These payments don't line up with his official income. And Evergreen Solutions. That's a front for CDC. I've seen their name pop up in other cases, but nothing ever sticks. Terrence's stomach turned. Carlson oversees the department's operations in the areas where I ruled against CDC. He has motive and means. If he's involved, he might be pulling strings to discredit me, or worse. The meeting with Officer Craig. Terrence decided it was time to speak with Officer Claire Craig again. She had seemed shaken during their initial encounter, but willing to acknowledge her mistakes. Perhaps she knew more about what was happening behind the scenes. He arranged to meet her at a coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. When Claire arrived, she looked uneasy, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting to be followed. "Thank you for coming," Terrence said, gesturing for her to sit. "I don't have much time," she replied, her voice low. "If anyone finds out I'm talking to you." "No one will," Terrence assured her. "I just need to understand something. That traffic stop, was it your decision, or were you ordered to do it?" Claire hesitated, biting her lip. I was told to pull you over," she admitted. "The call came from my precinct. They said your car matched the description of a stolen vehicle, but it didn't make sense. The details didn't add up." "Who gave the order?" Terrence pressed. She hesitated again, then sighed. "It came from Carlson's office, but I don't think it was just him. There's been talk, rumors about officers being pressured to overlook certain things, focus on certain people. I didn't want to believe it, but after what happened with you," her voice trailed off. Terrence leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Claire, you have a chance to do the right thing. If Carlson is involved in something corrupt, we need to expose it. Can I count on you?" She nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "I'll help, but we have to be careful. Carlson has eyes everywhere. A growing threat." Over the next few days, Terrence, Marcus, and Claire worked in secret. They discovered that Carlson had not only orchestrated the traffic stop, but was also linked to a string of questionable activities: falsified police reports, fabricated evidence, and intimidation tactics targeting community leaders who opposed CDC's projects. Their investigation took a darker turn when Marcus uncovered surveillance footage of Terrence's street. The footage showed an unmarked car parked near his home for hours before the mysterious figure appeared. The car's plates were registered to an off-the-books vehicle used by Carlson's precinct. "They're watching you," Marcus said bluntly, sliding the footage across the table. "We need to move fast. If they know we're onto them, things could escalate. A dangerous proposition. One evening, as Terrence reviewed the latest findings, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "We need to meet. Urgent. Warehouse on 5th and Ash. Midnight." Terrence frowned. The message was uncharacteristically cryptic, but Marcus had never steered him wrong before. At midnight, Terrence arrived at the warehouse, its dim lighting casting eerie shadows. Marcus was waiting near the entrance, a folder in hand. "This better be good," Terrence said. "It's not good. It's bad," Marcus replied. He handed over the folder, which contained copies of sealed court documents. These came from an anonymous source. They detail payments from CDC to city officials and police officers. Carlson's name is all over them. Marcus chuckled, but the levity was short-lived. The guards at the gate disappeared into the building, leaving the exterior temporarily unguarded. "It's time. Let's move." The trio exited the van, sticking to the shadows as they approached the fence. Claire quickly picked the lock on a side gate, and they slipped inside. The building loomed above them, its windows glowing faintly. Marcus led the way to a maintenance entrance at the rear, where Claire again worked her magic with the lock. Inside, the air smelled of industrial cleaner and faintly of oil. They moved silently through the labyrinth of corridors, guided by the blueprint Marcus had memorized. The vault. The safe was located in a secure office on the 18th floor. Their first major obstacle was an access-controlled elevator. Claire crouched by the control panel, attaching a small electronic device to the wires. "This bypass should give us access," she whispered. The device beeped, and the elevator doors slid open. "Nice work," Marcus said as they stepped inside. The ride to the 18th floor felt agonizingly slow. Each ding of the elevator made Terrence's pulse race. When the doors finally opened, they were met with an eerie silence. The office floor was dimly lit, and the rows of cubicles stood empty. "This way," Marcus whispered, leading them toward the executive offices. They found the door to the targeted office, its imposing steel safe glinting in the dim light. Claire immediately got to work. As she manipulated the lock, Terrence stood guard by the door, his nerves fraying with every passing second. "Hurry up," he urged. "I'm going as fast as I can." Claire shot back, her voice strained. "This isn't exactly a combination lock from a high school locker." The lock clicked, and the safe door swung open. Inside were neatly organized folders and ledgers, along with a small laptop. Marcus began photographing the documents while Terrence examined the contents. "These are exactly what we need," Terrence said, his voice filled with awe. "Payment records, contracts, emails. This ties CDC and Carlson directly to bribery, fraud, and intimidation." "Let's grab it and go," Marcus said, stuffing the laptop into a backpack. The escape. Just as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Claire froze, her eyes wide with alarm. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Marcus gestured toward a supply closet down the hall. "Hide. Now." They slipped into the closet just as a flashlight beam swept past. Through the slats of the door, Terrence could see 2 security guards patrolling the area. They stopped near the office, their voices low but audible. "Thought I heard something," one of them said. "Probably just the HVAC," the other replied. "Let's finish the sweep." The guards moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Terrence exhaled in relief, but Marcus held up a hand. "Not yet. Give them another minute." When they were sure the coast was clear, they exited the closet and made their way back to the elevator. The journey to the ground floor was even more nerve-wracking than the ascent, but they reached the maintenance exit without further incident. As they slipped back into the foggy night, Terrence allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had done it. They had the evidence. Fallout. The trio returned to Marcus's apartment, where they began sorting through the documents and files they had retrieved. The evidence was damning. Emails detailing bribes paid to Carlson and other officials, records of CDC's efforts to manipulate zoning laws, and even plans to frame Terrence as part of a smear campaign. "This is a goldmine," Marcus said, scrolling through the laptop's files. "With this, we can blow the lid off the whole operation." Terrence nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. "We can't just release this to the media. It needs to go to someone who can act on it, someone outside the reach of CDC and Carlson." "The State Attorney General's office," Claire suggested. "They've been investigating corruption in Crestfield for years, but haven't been able to pin anything down." Terrence agreed. "We'll go to the Age tomorrow. But we need to be ready. Carlson won't go down without a fight." As dawn broke over Crestfield, the trio knew they had crossed a line of no return. The evidence in their possession could change everything. But it also painted targets on their backs. The battle for justice had entered its most dangerous phase, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. Little did they know, the forces they were up against were already mobilizing, preparing to strike back with ruthless efficiency. The incident. It was a bright afternoon in the city of Crestfield, where the roads gleamed with rain-washed clarity, and the rhythm of life carried on undisturbed. Judge Terrence Lewis, a distinguished and respected African-American federal judge, was enjoying a rare moment of reprieve. His black Tesla glided smoothly down Elmwood Drive, the residential district known for its pristine lawns and colonial-style mansions. The scent of pine and the soft hum of the electric engine blended seamlessly, giving Terrence a fleeting sense of peace. Terrence had recently purchased his Tesla, a testament to decades of perseverance and integrity. As he drove, he reflected on the progress he'd made and the doors he'd opened for those who would follow. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. "Odd," Terrence murmured. He was sure he hadn't violated any traffic laws. Slowing down, he pulled his vehicle to the curb. A sense of unease crept into his chest as a white police officer approached the car, hand resting on her holstered weapon. "License and registration," the officer demanded, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Terrence complied without protest, retrieving his wallet from the console. "May I ask what this is about, officer?" "You may not," she snapped, taking the documents from his hand. She scrutinized them briefly, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back at him. "Step out of the car." Terrence frowned. "Excuse me? Is there a specific reason?" "Out of the car, now," she barked, her hand inching closer to her holster. "I won't ask again." Terrence felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a tension he had experienced growing up in a system often rigged against him. But he was no stranger to confrontation, and he understood the stakes. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the vehicle, his composure unwavering. "Hands on the car," the officer commanded. "Officer, Terrence began, but she cut him off sharply. "I said, hands on the car." The neighbors began to emerge, peeking through curtains and standing on porches. Their whispers formed an unsettling chorus. Terrence complied, placing his palms flat against the Tesla's sleek surface. "This car matches the description of one reported stolen last week," the officer stated as she began patting him down. "You'll need to come with me." Terrence's jaw tightened. "Officer, this car belongs to me. If you'll check the registration and cross-reference it." "I don't need your advice on how to do my job," she interjected, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Terrence turned to face her, his eyes steely. "Before you go any further, I suggest you verify my identity. I am Judge Terrence Lewis. You are about to arrest a federal judge without probable cause." The officer hesitated, the handcuffs dangling in her grip. "A judge?" she asked, skepticism dripping from her voice. "Yes, a judge," Terrence replied firmly. "Call your superior." Now, a tense silence hung between them. The officer, her confidence clearly shaken, reached for her radio. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor on Elmwood Drive." Over. 10 minutes later, a police SUV pulled up, and a burly man in his 50s stepped out. Captain Richard Moss was a seasoned officer, and his furrowed brow deepened as he approached the scene. He glanced at Terence, then at the officer. "What's going on here?" Captain Moss asked. The officer stammered. "This car. It matched the description of a stolen vehicle, and I was." "Did you verify his identity?" Moss interrupted. She faltered, her face flushing red. "Not yet, sir." Moss turned to Terence, his demeanor softening. "Judge Lewis, my apologies for this misunderstanding. We'll sort this out immediately." Terence nodded but remained silent, his gaze cutting through the officer who had detained him. After a moment, Moss ordered, "Stand down, Officer Craig. You'll accompany me back to the station to file a full report. And Judge Lewis, please accept our deepest apologies." Terence straightened his jacket, his composure intact despite the ordeal. "Captain Moss," he began, his voice steady, "this isn't just about me. This is a systemic issue, and it cannot be ignored." "I understand," Moss replied, though his tone suggested reluctance. "Perhaps we can discuss this further." "No," Terence said, shaking his head. "We will discuss it, and not later. Now." As the neighbors gathered closer, Terence stepped up onto the curb. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the crowd, "what you've witnessed today is not an isolated event. It's part of a much larger problem, one that needs to be addressed head-on." He turned back to Captain Moss. "This officer isn't the first to act on implicit bias, and she won't be the last unless there's change. I propose we begin with a dialogue, a meaningful one between the judiciary, the police force, and the community." The counterattack. Dawn broke over Crestfield, casting the city in a deceptive calm that belied the storm brewing beneath its surface. Judge Terence Lewis sat in Marcus Williams' modest apartment, bleary-eyed and sipping bitter coffee as they reviewed the damning evidence they had extracted from Crestfield Development Corporation, CDC. The sunlight streaming through the blinds painted stripes across the pile of documents and a laptop that now held the key to exposing the web of corruption. Claire Craig was at the kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through her phone. "It's all over the news," she said, her voice tight. "Someone leaked a story about you, Judge. They're claiming you've been under investigation for months. Bribery, case tampering, even tax fraud." Terence straightened, his jaw tightening. "They're moving fast. This is damage control. They know we're close." Marcus looked up from the laptop, his expression grim. "It's more than that. They're not just trying to discredit you. They're trying to destroy your credibility before you can go public with the truth." Terence's phone buzzed. A new text from the same unknown number that had warned him before appeared on the screen. "You've gone too far. This is your last chance to back off." He showed the message to Marcus and Claire. "They're watching us. They know we have the evidence." Marcus rubbed his temples. "We don't have time to waste. The State Attorney General's office opens in 2 hours. We need to be the first ones through the door." Terence nodded. "Agreed. But we have to assume we're being followed. We need to split up and take different routes. The last thing we need is to lead them straight to the edge." The break-in. As Marcus and Claire packed the evidence into separate secure bags, Terence noticed something odd. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the apartment seemed to be joined by another sound, a low, rhythmic buzzing. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus stopped what he was doing and listened. His eyes narrowed. "It's coming from outside." He crept to the window and peered through the blinds. A black SUV idled across the street, its windows tinted so dark they were nearly opaque. "That's not just anyone," Marcus muttered. "That's surveillance." Claire's face paled. "They've already found us." Suddenly, the apartment's front door rattled violently. Someone was trying to force their way in. "Move," Marcus barked, drawing his service weapon. Out the back. Terence and Claire scrambled to grab the evidence as Marcus held his position near the door. "Go. I'll hold them off," he shouted. "No way," Terrence said, grabbing Marcus by the arm. "We're not leaving you behind." Marcus glared at him, but relented as the door's hinges creaked under the strain. The three of them bolted out the back door, exiting into a narrow alley that ran behind the building. As they sprinted toward Claire's car parked a block away, the sound of boots pounding on the pavement echoed behind them. "They're coming," Claire gasped. Marcus turned and fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack reverberating through the alley. The pursuers hesitated, giving the trio just enough time to reach the car. They piled in, and Claire gunned the engine, tires screeching as they sped away. A desperate gamble. The city blurred past them as Claire weaved through traffic, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Terrence sat in the passenger seat, clutching the bag of evidence like a lifeline, while Marcus kept an eye on their tail. "They're still following," Marcus said, his voice taut. "We need to lose them." Claire's eyes darted to the GPS. "There's a parking garage 2 blocks from here. If we can get in and switch cars, we might have a chance." As they pulled into the garage, the pursuers hesitated at the entrance, seemingly unsure of which level they had gone to. Claire parked near an old dusty sedan, and Marcus quickly popped the lock with a tool from his jacket. "Get in," Marcus ordered. They switched cars in record time and exited the garage on the opposite side, merging into a stream of early morning commuters. Marcus glanced behind them. "Looks like we shook them. For now." The Attorney General's office. They arrived at the State Attorney General's office an hour later, the towering government building an imposing fortress of glass and steel. The three of them entered through a side entrance, avoiding the bustling main lobby. Terrence had already contacted Sarah Chen, an old friend from law school who now held a senior position in the Age's office. Moss appeared hesitant, but ultimately nodded. "Agreed, Judge. Let's meet tomorrow and map out a path forward." Terrence glanced at the officer one last time before returning to his vehicle. The fresh leather smell now felt tainted by the weight of the incident, but as he drove away, a new resolve took root in his heart. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test his limits and change the trajectory of his life. Seeds of change. The following day, Judge Terrence Lewis stood in his chambers, a sleek office tucked within the towering Crestfield Federal Courthouse. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows on walls lined with bookshelves containing legal tomes. Normally, this space felt like a fortress, a sanctuary of justice where the rule of law reigned supreme. Today, it felt smaller, almost stifling. Yesterday's incident weighed heavily on his mind. The morning had begun with emails and phone calls, some supportive, others less so. Social media was abuzz with the event, neighbors posting their accounts and videos of the traffic stop. Most were sympathetic, but some comments revealed a more sinister undercurrent, defending the officer's actions or questioning why a man like him drove such an expensive car. Terrence shook his head as he scrolled through the comments on his tablet. The truth was plain. Society had a long way to go, and yesterday had been a stark reminder. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Detective Marcus Williams, a close friend and seasoned investigator, entered. Marcus was a burly man with a clean-shaven head and a no-nonsense demeanor, but today, his usual jovial energy was absent. "Marcus," Terrence greeted, gesturing for him to sit. "Thanks for coming." Marcus sat across from him, his expression serious. "I saw the footage, Terrence." "You okay?" "I'm fine," Terrence replied, though his voice betrayed fatigue. "But this isn't about me. What happened yesterday is part of something much bigger." Marcus nodded. "I hear you. You've been pushing for judicial reform for years, and I've been fighting corruption in the department just as long. This isn't new to either of us." "No, it's not," Terrence agreed. "But what's different now is the visibility. People are paying attention. This could be a turning point." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "So, what's your plan?" Terrence steepled his fingers, his gaze thoughtful. I spoke with Captain Moss yesterday. He agreed to a meeting with key stakeholders, community leaders, police officers, and members of the judiciary. It's a start, but I want more than dialogue. We need action. Marcus smirked. You always did aim high. But if anyone can pull this off, it's you. Later that afternoon, the meeting convened in the courthouse's conference room. The space was utilitarian, with a long wooden table and chairs that squeaked slightly whenever someone shifted. Around the table sat an eclectic mix. Captain Moss, Officer Claire Craig, the officer who had detained Terrence, local community activists, a few clergy members, and 2 representatives from the mayor's office. Marcus stood at the back, observing quietly. Terrence rose, commanding the room's attention. He began with a recount of the previous day's incident, speaking not as a victim, but as a witness to a systemic failure. What happened yesterday isn't about a single officer or a single mistake, he said, his voice firm but measured. It's about the unspoken biases that permeate our institutions and erode trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Officer Craig shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Though she had apologized privately, her presence at the meeting was contentious. Some community leaders had protested her inclusion, but Terrence insisted she attend. To him, healing required confrontation, not avoidance. A community activist named Angela Ruiz spoke next. She was a fiery orator, known for her work advocating for underserved communities. Judge Lewis is right, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. But words aren't enough. We've heard promises of reform before, only to see them fizzle out. What will make this time different? Terrence nodded, her words resonating. This time, we'll hold each other accountable. I propose a pilot program, a partnership between the courts and the police department. Officers like Claire will spend time shadowing judges in court, while judges will ride along with officers to witness their challenges firsthand. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a start. Terrence flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. This is enough to blow the whole thing open. Not quite, Marcus said grimly. It's not admissible in court. The source isn't verified, and these are copies. We need the originals. Where are they? Terrence asked. Marcus hesitated. According to the source, they're in a safe at CDC's headquarters. If we can get them. Terrence shook his head. You're suggesting we break into CDC. Marcus shrugged. I'm suggesting we finish this. If we don't, Carlson and his people will bury us before we can take another step. Terrence exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. But we're doing it carefully and legally, if possible. A race against time. As they planned their next move, the stakes became clearer. CDC wasn't just targeting Terrence. It was manipulating the city's justice system, police force, and government to serve its interests. The deeper they dug, the more connections they uncovered, revealing a sprawling web of corruption. But with every step forward, the danger grew. Surveillance on Terrence's home intensified. Claire reported being followed on more than one occasion. Marcus received veiled threats through anonymous calls. The clock was ticking, and Terrence knew they had one chance to expose the truth before it was too late. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized the cost of failure would be far greater than any of them could have imagined. Into the lion's den. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation, paranoia, and mounting pressure. Judge Terrence Lewis, Detective Marcus Williams, and Officer Claire Craig had gathered enough evidence to expose the sprawling corruption tied to Crestfield Development Corporation, CDC, and Deputy Chief Richard Carlson. But the task ahead was perilous. Obtaining the final, irrefutable proof, original documents locked in a safe at CDC's heavily secured headquarters. The stakes had never been higher. Each member of their unlikely trio knew the risks, but they also understood that the truth could not be buried. If they failed, their lives and careers would be ruined. If they succeeded, They could bring down an empire of corruption. A dangerous plan. The plan was as intricate as it was audacious. Marcus had identified a vulnerability in CDC's security, a late-night maintenance shift change during which the building's security detail was temporarily reduced. Their window of opportunity was razor-thin, less than 30 minutes. Terrence leaned over the blueprint of the CDC building spread across Marcus's dining table. "Are we sure about this?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "This isn't exactly the type of thing a federal judge is supposed to do." Marcus smirked. "You want to go by the book. Then we wait for Carlson and CDC to destroy the evidence. They'll come after you next, and you'll have no defense. Sometimes you've got to bend the rules to protect them." Terrence exhaled sharply. "I just want to make sure we're not walking into a trap." Claire, seated on the opposite side, nodded. "I've been monitoring Carlson's movements. He's paranoid, but he's also cocky. He's not expecting anyone to come after him like this. He thinks he's untouchable." Terrence looked between them, his allies in this high-stakes gambit. "Fine," he said. "We move forward, but no unnecessary risks. If things go sideways, we pull out." Infiltration. On the night of the operation, the city was cloaked in a chilly fog. The CDC headquarters loomed in the distance, a glass and steel behemoth surrounded by a chain-link fence and patrolled by private security guards. From their vantage point in an abandoned van a block away, Terrence, Marcus, and Claire observed the building through binoculars. "Shift change in 5 minutes," Marcus said, his voice calm but tense. "Once the guards head inside, we move." Claire checked her equipment, a small flashlight, gloves, and a set of lock-picking tools she'd borrowed from a colleague who owed her a favor. "Remember, the security cameras loop every 15 seconds. Timing is everything." Terrence adjusted his black hoodie, feeling out of place in the makeshift gear. "And if we get caught?" Marcus shot him a wry grin. "You're the judge. You tell them we're conducting a surprise inspection of CDC's safety measures." "That's not funny," Terrence muttered. Sarah met them in a secure conference room, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Terrence, what the hell is going on? I've been getting calls all morning about you." "They're trying to smear me," Terrence said, setting the evidence on the table. "But this will clear everything up. It's all here. Proof of corruption involving Crestfield Development Corporation, Deputy Chief Carlson, and half a dozen city officials." Sarah opened the bag and began reviewing the documents and files. Her eyes widened as she scanned the pages. This is explosive. If this is verified, it could bring down half the city's leadership." "That's the idea," Marcus said grimly. "But we need to move fast. They've already tried to kill us once this morning." Sarah looked up sharply. "Kill you?" "Long story," Claire muttered, glancing nervously at the door. Sarah closed the bag and stood. "I'll take this to the Attorney General immediately. You 3 stay here, don't talk to anyone, and don't leave the building." The tipping point. As the minutes stretched into hours, the trio waited in tense silence. Every creak of the floor, every distant voice, felt like a potential threat. Terrence couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of Carlson's reach. Finally, Sarah returned, accompanied by 2 armed security officers. Her face was pale but determined. "The Attorney General is taking this very seriously," she said. "The evidence is being verified as we speak, and an investigation is already underway. You did the right thing bringing this here." Before they could respond, the conference room door burst open. A man in a tailored suit stormed in, his face red with anger. Behind him were 2 uniformed officers. "Judge Lewis," the man snarled. "I'm Special Agent Derek Hayes, FBI. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy." Marcus and Claire jumped to their feet, but Sarah stepped between them and the agents. "You have no jurisdiction here," she snapped. "This is an active investigation under the authority of the State Attorney General." Hayes smirked. "We have our orders. Stand down." Terrence stood, His expression calm despite the chaos. "Agent Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "If you arrest me, the public will know exactly why. Do you really think Carlson's reach extends this far? Because if it does, you're implicating your own agency." For a moment, the room was silent. Hayes's smirk faltered as he realized the implications. Sarah seized the opportunity. "If you want to escalate this, be my guest. But I promise you, the Age will ensure this ends up in the headlines tomorrow. Your call, Agent." Hayes hesitated, then growled in frustration. "This isn't over." As the agents retreated, Terrence let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Sarah turned to him, her eyes sharp. "You're playing a dangerous game, Terrence." "I don't have a choice," he replied. "This isn't just about me. It's about justice." A glimmer of hope. By nightfall, news of the investigation began leaking to the press. Terrence watched from a secure room as reporters speculated about the scandal. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light. But as he looked out the window at the city skyline, he knew the fight was far from over. Carlson and CDC wouldn't go down without a fight. They had power, money, and influence, everything needed to strike back. Terrence turned to Marcus and Claire, their faces weary but resolute. "We've won a battle," he said, "but the war is just beginning." The reckoning. The morning after the evidence reached the state attorney general's office, Crestfield awoke to a city on edge. News outlets were ablaze with reports of a massive corruption investigation implicating powerful figures in the local government, law enforcement, and Crestfield Development Corporation, CDC. It was a scandal unlike anything the city had seen before, and at the center of it stood Judge Terrence Lewis, a man now both celebrated and vilified in equal measure. In a nondescript safe house provided by the Attorney General's office, Terrence sat at a small table, staring at the flickering screen of a television. Every channel carried the story. Reporters speculated on how deep the corruption ran, while pundits debated whether Terrence was a hero or a conspirator in over his head. Marcus Williams leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "It's out there now," he said. "No taking it back." Claire Craig sat nearby, nursing a bandaged arm, a souvenir from their escape. "They're not going to take this lying down," she said, her voice wary. "Carlson, CDC, the people who've been pulling the strings. They're too powerful." Terrence nodded, his expression grim. "That's why we have to stay ahead of them." The room erupted into a flurry of reactions. Some praised the idea. Others expressed skepticism. Captain Moss cleared his throat, drawing attention. "I support this proposal," he said. "It won't be easy, and it won't fix everything, but it's a step in the right direction." Officer Craig finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear. "I'll do it," she said, looking directly at Terrence. "I know I have a lot to learn, and this could be a chance to start." Angela raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, she turned to the mayor's representatives. "What about funding? Initiatives like this don't run on goodwill alone." One of the representatives, a young man named Daniel Green, adjusted his tie. "The mayor's office is open to allocating resources, but we'll need to see a concrete plan first." As the meeting adjourned, Terrence felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The groundwork was laid, but he knew implementation would be fraught with challenges. Marcus approached as the others filtered out. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Terrence," he said, though his tone held admiration. "I know," Terrence replied, "but it's worth it." Before Marcus could respond, Terrence's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You're making powerful enemies. Watch your back, Judge." Terrence's stomach dropped, but he quickly composed himself. He showed the message to Marcus, who frowned deeply. "This isn't idle," Marcus said. "Someone's watching you." "I figured as much," Terrence replied. "But it only confirms that we're on the right track." That evening, Terrence returned home to find his street unusually quiet. The normally lively neighborhood seemed cloaked in an unnatural stillness, As he parked his car, he noticed a figure lingering near the corner, a tall man in a dark jacket, his face obscured by a hood. Terrence entered his house and locked the door behind him, an unease settling in his chest. Pulling out his phone, he called Marcus. "I think I'm being watched," Terrence said, keeping his voice low. "Do you want me to send someone over?" Marcus asked. "No," Terrence replied. "Not yet. Let's see how this plays out." That night, sleep eluded him. He sat in his study, poring over files from old cases. Years of rulings flashed before him. But one name kept surfacing: Crestfield Development Corporation, a major player in the city's real estate scene. They had been implicated in several corruption cases over the years, cases where Terrence had consistently ruled against them. Could this be retaliation, or was it something even deeper? By dawn, Terrence had resolved to dig further. He called Marcus again, detailing his suspicions about Crestfield Development. "I'll look into it," Marcus promised, "but you be careful. If they're behind this, they won't play fair." "I never expected them to," Terrence replied. The seeds of change had been planted, but Terrence knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger. As the sun rose over Crestfield, he steeled himself for the battles to come, unaware of just how far-reaching the conspiracy would prove to be. The deeper layers of deception. The air in Crestfield felt heavy the following day, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Judge Terrence Lewis sat in his chambers, surrounded by stacks of case files, his mind racing. The previous night had been sleepless. The shadowy figure on his street and the cryptic text message loomed in his thoughts. Something wasn't adding up. Terrence's instincts told him the attempted traffic stop wasn't an isolated incident. It was the tip of a much larger iceberg. Now, with the whispers of retaliation from Crestfield Development Corporation, CDC, swirling in his mind, he decided to dig deeper. Years on the bench had taught him that even the most seemingly chaotic events often followed a pattern. His job was to find it. The paper trail begins. Terrence's first stop that morning wasn't his courtroom, but his old friend Detective Marcus Williams' precinct. Marcus, always the early bird, was already at his desk, sipping coffee and poring over a case file. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus said as Terrence approached. "Feels like I might be haunted by a few soon," Terrence replied, taking a seat. "I've been going through some of my rulings. The name Crestfield Development Corporation keeps coming up." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "CDC, that's a big fish. They're tied to half the real estate deals in this city. What are you thinking?" Terrence leaned forward. "I've ruled against them in at least 3 major cases: environmental violations, unfair labor practices, and a zoning dispute. Each time, their lawyers left the courtroom furious. I didn't think much of it back then, but now." Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the lot. Claire dragged Ethan behind cover while Terrence crouched low, his heart pounding. Marcus returned fire, his shots precise. One of the assailants fell, and the others hesitated, allowing the group to scramble into their car. "Go, go, go," Marcus yelled as Claire gunned the engine, speeding away into the night. The testimony. By dawn, Ethan was safely in the custody of the state attorney general's office. His testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Carlson and CDC executives had orchestrated bribes, falsified safety reports, and intimidated anyone who dared to oppose them. With Ethan's statement, the AG's office moved swiftly. Arrest warrants were issued, and within hours, news outlets reported the takedown of several high-ranking officials, including Deputy Chief Carlson. A new beginning. Days later, Terrence stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters. His voice was steady, his words measured. "This isn't just about corruption in Crestfield. It's about justice and accountability. No one is above the law, no matter how powerful they think they are." As he stepped away from the podium, Marcus and Claire joined him. "You did it," Claire said, her voice filled with admiration. "No," Terrence replied. "We did it." For the first time in weeks, Terrence felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fight wasn't over. Rebuilding trust in Crestfield would take years. But for now, justice had prevailed. And that, he thought, was a victory worth celebrating.